Four people filed a complaint about something overhead the night Marcus Almeida disappeared. None of them described the same thing. The RF detection log showed a 12-second emission at 1:47 a.m. on a frequency we don't monitor. Our system flagged it anyway because the waveform matched the signature profile of a commercial UAS broadcasting remote ID, but the registration number it returned doesn't exist. I pulled the complaint forms the next morning. One woman said it was a large drone with red lights. One man said it was silent and dark, moving too slowly. A teenager described a sound like fabric tearing. The fourth complainant, an elderly man on Euclid Avenue, said he watched it land in the street and walk. All four reported it within the same 9-minute window. The locations they gave formed a line roughly 1.3 miles long, oriented northeast, pointing directly at the lot behind Marcus Almeida's apartment building, where his car was found the following day with the engine running and both shoes on the passenger seat. I should explain what we do and why any of this landed on my desk. The Cuyahoga County Integrated Airspace Monitoring Center, we just call it the IAMC, is a joint operation between the County Sheriff's Office and the Regional FAA Coordination District. It was funded in 2024 through a DHS counter-UAS appropriation and went fully operational in early 2025. The facility is on the third floor of the County Justice Complex in downtown Cleveland, in a windowless suite that used to be a records annex. 5 analyst stations arranged in a shallow arc facing a central video wall. 3 8-hour shifts. Always at least 2 analysts on duty. The only thing we don't do ourselves is interdiction. If we identify a genuine UAS threat, we escalate to the sheriff's tactical unit or, in controlled airspace situations, to the FAA's Cleveland TRACON. Our job, in plain language, is to watch for drones that shouldn't be there. The system we operate is called Vortex, Volumetric Operational Radar and Telemetry Exchange. It's a layered detection platform. RF sensors on 11 rooftop nodes across the metro area passively listen for control signals and remote ID broadcasts. For ground-based radar units provide low-altitude tracking. The whole thing feeds into a unified display where every detected object gets classified by the software: commercial UAS, recreational UAS, manned aircraft, bird, weather, or unknown. If an object can't be classified or doesn't broadcast valid remote ID, it gets tagged as an unregistered flight and routed to whichever analyst is running the detection desk. Most of the time, unregistered flights are hobbyists who haven't updated their firmware, or kids with sub-250-gram toys that don't require registration. You pull the track, check the behavior profile, altitude, speed, duration, proximity to restricted zones, and either flag it for follow-up or close it out with a code. UF-1 means confirmed recreational, no action. UF-2 means commercial operator without current authorization, referred for enforcement. UF-3 means potential threat, escalated immediately. UF-4 means sensor error or environmental artifact, disregarded. There is also UF-5. The handbook defines it as detection event consistent with UAS signature but lacking confirmable object. Retain log. Do not escalate. Await recurrence before reclassification. I'd been at the IAMC for 11 months before I ever used a UF-5 code. My name is Renata Voigt. I'm 31. Before this I spent 4 years as a criminal intelligence analyst for the city of Akron, doing link analysis on drug networks and writing target packages for narcotics detectives. I took the IAMC position because it paid better and because I was tired of looking at the same faces committing the same crimes in the same intersections. I wanted something cleaner. Something where the data was the data and you didn't have to wonder whether a confidential informant was lying to you. The team in early 2025 was 5 of us across 3 shifts. Daryl Keenan ran the day desk with me, ex-Air Force, 11 years in air traffic management, quiet in a way that meant he'd already thought through whatever you were about to say. Lena Morrow and James Willett covered the swing shift. And the overnight was Michelle Pack, alone, which technically violated the 2-analyst minimum but which nobody had corrected because Michelle had seniority, didn't want a partner, and had never missed a flag in 3 years of prior counter-UAS work in the private sector. For the first 8 months, the work was exactly what I wanted. Patterns without politics. We averaged about 40 unregistered flight detections per week across the metro area. 35 of those would be UF-1 closures. 3 or 4 would be UF-2 referrals. Maybe once a month we'd get a UF-3 that turned out to be a real concern, usually a commercial operator flying in restricted airspace near Burke Lakefront or the Hopkins Approach Corridor. The FAA would handle it. We'd get a resolution code back. The system worked. The UF-5 codes were rare. Michelle logged the first one I ever saw, back in June 2025. A detection at 2:11 a.m. over the Tremont neighborhood. Strong RF signature, clean remote ID broadcast with a registration number that returned no match in any federal database. Radar painted an object at 340 feet AGL, moving at 14 knots on a steady heading, then the track vanished. Not faded, vanished. One sweep it was there, the next it wasn't. No descent profile, no landing, no signal loss. Just gone. Michelle coded it UF-5. I found it in the log the next morning and asked Daryl about it. "You'll see those," he said, not looking up from his screen. "System's good but it's not perfect. Multipath reflections, atmospheric ducting, RF bleed from ground sources. If it doesn't come back, it wasn't there." I accepted that. It was a reasonable explanation and Daryl was not a person who offered unreasonable ones. But Michelle's UF-5 did come back. Same area, 6 days later. Same altitude, same speed, same heading, same impossible registration number. And then it happened again 4 days after that. Michelle logged each one. By mid-July, she had 9 entries, all in the same narrow corridor, a strip about 3/4 of a mile wide running from the flats up through Ohio City and into the near west side. I started reviewing her logs carefully. Not because I doubted her codes, but because the pattern was unusual enough to be interesting, and interesting was the thing that had brought me to this work. The 9th detection was different. It had a companion. At 1:33 a.m. on July 19, Vortex flagged 2 simultaneous RF emissions in the corridor. Both broadcast remote ID. Both returned the same non-existent registration number. They were separated by 0.4 miles and moving in parallel at identical speed and heading. The radar confirmed 2 discrete objects at 340 and 355 feet AGL. Then both tracks disappeared simultaneously between sweeps. Michelle's log note for that entry read, "Dual detection, synchronized movement, identical false RID. Not consistent with any known multipath or reflection artifact. Retaining for pattern review." UF-5. I printed that log page and put it in a folder I'd started keeping in my desk drawer. I wasn't alarmed. I was doing what I'm trained to do, accumulating data points until a pattern declares itself. The pattern declared itself in August. Marcus Almeida was a 38-year-old electrician who lived alone in a second-floor apartment on West 58th Street, which is inside the corridor. He was reported missing by his employer on August 4 after failing to show up for 3 consecutive shifts. Cleveland PD opened a missing persons case. His car was found behind his building, engine running, shoes on the seat. His apartment was locked from the inside, chain engaged. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. His phone was on the kitchen counter at 37% battery. I would not have connected any of this to our detection logs if it weren't for the complaints. The IAMC has a public-facing intake line. Citizens can call to report drone activity, unauthorized overflights, privacy concerns, noise complaints. We get maybe 5 a week, usually from people who saw a neighbor's DJI and didn't like it. But on August 4, 4 complaints came in within a 90-minute window, all reporting aerial activity in the corridor between 1:30 and 2 a.m. I pulled them as part of my morning review. That's when I read the descriptions I mentioned at the start. The woman who said red lights. The men who said dark and silent. The teenager who said fabric tearing. The old men who said it landed and walked. I cross-referenced the complaint timestamps against Michelle's overnight log. She had flagged a UF-5 at 1:47 a.m. One object, corridor track, identical non-existent registration. Duration, 12 seconds. 12 seconds of detection. For witnesses across 1.3 miles. And a man missing from the end of the line they described. I showed the correlation to Daryl that afternoon. He looked at it for a long time. Longer than I'd ever seen him look at anything. Then he said, "The complaints are about a drone. The missing person is a police matter. We don't work missing persons. The detection log connects them geographically and temporally. The detection log shows a 12-second sensor event that we've already coded as unconfirmable. You're drawing a line between a UF-5 and a CPD case. That's not what we do." He wasn't wrong. Jurisdictionally, he was completely right. And that should have been the end of it. But I pulled Marcus Almeida's address and overlaid it on the corridor map. His building sat 220 feet from the projected track terminus of every UF-5 detection Michelle had logged since June. Not near it. Not in the neighborhood. 220 feet from the exact point where the tracks consistently vanished. I didn't tell Daryl that. Not yet. Instead, I started doing something I hadn't done since my years in Akron, building a target package. Not on a person, on the corridor itself. I pulled every UF-5 Michelle had logged. I mapped them. I timestamped them. I calculated intervals. I requested a data export of all RF characteristics from the flagged emissions and ran them through a comparison matrix I'd built for a narcotics communication intercept project years ago. The results were consistent in ways that made the sensor error explanation very difficult to sustain. Every emission was on the same frequency, 915.7 MHz, which falls within the ISM band commonly used by commercial drones for remote ID broadcast. Every emission used the same modulation scheme. Every one broadcast the same non-existent registration number, FA3-7791KX04. Every radar return showed an object between 330 and 360 feet AGL, moving between 12 and 16 knots, on a heading between 038 and 044 degrees magnetic. The consistency wasn't approximate. It was mechanical. But the objects weren't mechanical. Not according to the radar cross-section data. When Vortex's radar paints a commercial drone, a Matrice 300, a Skydio X10, anything with rotors and a composite frame, the return has a characteristic signature. Hard edges, rotor modulation, predictable RCS values. The returns from the corridor detections didn't look like that. The cross-section was larger than any commercial UAS in our database. The shape profile was irregular and non-repeating, which the system interpreted as noise but which, when I pulled the raw data and looked at it frame by frame, appeared more like something whose geometry was changing between sweeps. I sat with that data for 3 days before I said anything to anyone. On September 2nd, I brought it to a full team briefing. All 5 of us, which only happened once a month for administrative review. I presented the corridor pattern, the RF consistency, the RCS anomalies, and the temporal correlation with the Almeida disappearance. I did not editorialize. I presented it the way I'd present a target package. Here is the data, here is the pattern, here is what the pattern suggests we should look at next. Daryl listened without expression. Lena looked uncomfortable. James took notes. Michelle, who had logged every one of these detections alone at 3 in the morning, said nothing for the entire presentation. When I finished, she said one thing. There have been more since August. She'd continued logging UF-5s in the corridor. 3 more detections in the 17 days since Almeida disappeared. But the pattern had changed. The track was longer. It now extended from the flats all the way through Ohio City, past the West 58th Street vanishing point, and into the Cudell neighborhood, an additional 1.8 miles of corridor that had previously been clean. It's expanding, I said. Or we're getting better at detecting it, Daryl said. But he didn't say it with conviction. The second disappearance happened 11 days later. Diana Quezada, 44, lived on Lawn Avenue, which is in Cudell. The new section of the corridor. Reported missing September 13th by her adult daughter. Same profile, car present, apartment undisturbed, personal belongings untouched, phone left behind. Cleveland PD opened a case. No suspects, no leads, no signs of forced entry. No public complaints this time. But Michelle's overnight log showed a UF-5 detection at 2:06 a.m. on September 12, one day before the missing persons report, with a track that terminated 180 feet from Diana Quezada's front door. I pulled the Almeida data and compared it. His disappearance was estimated by CPD at some time during the night of August 3. Michelle's UF-5 for that night was logged at 1:47 a.m. on August 4, meaning the detection and the estimated time of disappearance overlapped. For Quezada, the detection was September 12. She was last confirmed seen on September 11. Her daughter reported her missing on the 13th when she didn't answer calls for 2 days. The detection preceded the confirmed absence. I want to be precise about what that means and what it doesn't. It doesn't prove the detection caused the disappearance. It doesn't prove they're related at all. People go missing for many reasons. But when you work in intelligence analysis for long enough, you develop what my old supervisor in Akron called pattern gravity, the sense that a correlation has accumulated enough mass that ignoring it requires more effort than investigating it. I went to Daryl with the Quezada correlation on September 15. This time, his silence was different. He pulled up the corridor map on his own workstation and stared at it. Then he asked me a question I wasn't expecting. When's the next one? I didn't have an answer. The detection intervals were irregular, 6 days, 4 days, 9 days, 6 days, 3 days. No clean periodicity. But the trend was toward compression. The gaps were getting shorter. I don't know when, I said. But if the corridor keeps extending on the same heading, the next section would push into the Stockyards neighborhood. West 25th Corridor. Daryl picked up his phone and called someone. He spoke for about 4 minutes in a voice too low for me to hear clearly, then hung up and told me he'd requested a formal interagency consultation with the FAA's Regional Security Office. Not an escalation, a consultation. He wanted someone outside our system to look at the RF data and tell us whether there was a technical explanation we were missing. The FAA sent a field engineer named Boyd Resnick on September 22. He was polite, thorough, and visibly unimpressed. He spent 6 hours in our center, reviewed the detection logs, examined the RF data, and ran his own analysis on the radar cross-section returns. At the end of the day, he sat down with Daryl and me and gave us his assessment. "Your RF detections are real," he said. "Something is broadcasting on 915.7 in your corridor. The remote ID format is valid but the registration is fabricated. That's a federal violation, but it's not uncommon. You can spoof a remote ID broadcast with off-the-shelf hardware. What I can't explain is the radar data. The RCS values don't correspond to any UAS platform I'm aware of. The cross-section is too large and too variable. If I had to guess, I'd say you're painting something biological, a large bird, maybe a group of birds in close formation, that happens to be flying through the same area where someone is operating a spoofed RID transmitter on the ground. The track moves," I said. "At 14 knots, on a consistent heading. For up to 12 miles. Birds do that. And the RID broadcast moves with it. Same speed, same track." Resnick paused. "That would require the transmitter to be mounted on whatever you're painting. Which, if it's biological, doesn't make sense." "No," I said. "It doesn't." He left us with a recommendation to file a formal UAS enforcement referral for the spoofed registration and to upgrade the corridor detections from UF-5 to UF-2. Daryl thanked him and did neither. He kept the UF-5 codes. When I asked why, he said, "Because we don't know what it is, and UF-2 means we're claiming it's a commercial drone without authorization. I'm not signing my name to a classification I can't support." That was the moment I understood Daryl was taking this seriously. He had been taking it seriously for longer than I realized. 3 days after Resnick's visit, Daryl showed me something he hadn't shared with the team. He'd been running his own analysis, not on the corridor detections, but on the detection gaps. The periods between UF-5 events. He'd mapped them against the IAMC's own operational schedule, and what he found was this: every detection occurred during a shift when the analyst on duty was actively reviewing the corridor data. Not just on duty. Actively reviewing. Michelle had been the overnight analyst for all of the original detections. She was also the only overnight analyst who had been pulling the corridor logs and studying them. James, who covered overnights when Michelle was off rotation, had never logged a single UF-5 in the corridor, and James had never looked at the corridor data outside of routine system sweeps. "It could be confirmation bias," Daryl said. "Michelle is looking for it, so she sees it. James isn't looking, so he doesn't. Except the detections are system-generated," I said. "Vortex flags them automatically. It doesn't matter whether the analyst is looking. The flag would appear on anyone's screen. Only if the RF emission occurs." We looked at each other. "You're saying the emissions only occur when someone is paying attention to the corridor?" "I'm saying the correlation is there." I'm not saying what it means. I went back through the logs that night. I checked every UF-5 in the corridor against the analyst activity records, which workstation was active, what data was being accessed, at what time. Vortex logs all of this automatically for audit purposes. The correlation was perfect. Every single corridor detection occurred within a window when the analyst on duty had the corridor map or corridor RF history open on their screen. 0 detections during shifts when the corridor data was not being actively accessed. I felt something shift in my chest when I confirmed that number. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize an equation has a variable you didn't know was in it, and the variable is you. I brought this to the next briefing. I showed the team the correlation. The room went quiet in a way that rooms go quiet when 5 people are all thinking the same thing and none of them wants to say it. Lena spoke first. So we stopped looking. We closed the corridor out of the active monitoring queue and let it run on passive detection only. If the emissions stop, we know it was an artifact of our attention. If they continue, we know it's independent. It was the most logical suggestion anyone had made in weeks. We implemented it that day. The corridor was removed from all analyst watch lists. No one was to pull corridor data, review corridor logs, or access corridor RF history for 30 days. Vortex would continue to collect data passively, but no human eyes would be on it. The 30 days began on October 1st. On October 9th, a man named Gerald Watkins disappeared from his home on West 32nd Street. Stockyards neighborhood. Exactly where I had predicted the corridor would extend. Same profile, vehicle present, home undisturbed, phone left behind. Cleveland PD opened a case. I found out about it from the news, not from our system. Because we weren't looking at the corridor. When the 30 days ended on October 31st, I pulled the passive detection archive for the entire period. 12 UF-5 grade events. 12 RF emissions on 915.7 MHz with the same fabricated registration. 12 radar tracks in the corridor, now extended an additional 2.1 miles through the stockyards and into Brooklyn Center. 12 objects that appeared and vanished between sweeps. The emissions had not stopped when we stopped looking. They had accelerated. During the months when Michelle and I were actively monitoring, the average interval between detections was 5.2 days. During the 30 days when no one was watching, the average interval dropped to 2.5 days. Our attention hadn't been feeding it. Our attention had been slowing it down. I sat at my workstation staring at that number for a long time. Daryl was beside me. He'd pulled the same data independently and reached the same conclusion. What does that mean? I asked him. It means the observation protocol was doing something. Not detecting. Not causing. Something else. Suppressing. He didn't answer. I thought about the 3 people who had disappeared from inside the corridor. I thought about the 12 detections that had occurred while we deliberately looked away. I thought about how many of those detections corresponded to addresses where someone was no longer answering their phone. I started cross-referencing that afternoon. I pulled every missing persons report filed with Cleveland PD during the 30-day blackout period. There were 23 across the entire city, a normal volume for a metro area of Cleveland's size. But 5 of those 23 were from addresses within the corridor. The corridor covers roughly 6% of the city's residential area. 5 out of 23 is 22%. I looked at the months prior. June through September, when Michelle and I had been actively monitoring 6 corridor detections per month, 1 disappearance every 5 to 6 weeks. October, when we stopped, 12 detections in 30 days, 5 disappearances. The data was telling me something I did not want to understand. Every hour I spent looking at the corridor reduced the frequency of the detections, and by extension, reduced the number of people who vanished. Every hour I looked away, the frequency increased. I was not investigating a phenomenon. I was containing it. And I had voluntarily stopped. I went to Daryl's desk and said, "We need to resume active monitoring immediately." He had the same numbers on his screen. I know. And we need to talk about what this actually is. No, he said. We don't. We need to watch the corridor. That's what we need to do. He was right and he was wrong at the same time. He was right that the immediate priority was resumption of monitoring. He was wrong that we could continue doing this without understanding what we were containing. But I deferred to him because he had seniority and because, in that moment, the operational decision was clear even if the larger question was not. We put the corridor back on active monitoring on November 1st. I took the day desk, focusing my entire screen on the corridor map and RF history. Michelle resumed overnight coverage with explicit instructions to keep the corridor data visible at all times. The detections slowed immediately. November 1st through November 7th, 1 event. November 8th through 14th, 0. November 15th, 1 event, and I was the one who saw it. It happened at 2:17 p.m. Broad daylight. That had never occurred before. Every prior detection had been between midnight and 4 a.m. The RF hit came in on 915.7. Same registration, FA3-7791KX04, radar painted an object at 310 feet over the Fulton Road corridor, moving northeast at 11 knots. I was watching the screen when it appeared. For the first time, I had a detection in real time, under my own eyes, during the day when I could also look out a window, except our center doesn't have windows. I could only see what Vortex showed me. The track persisted for 9 seconds. Then it vanished. But in those 9 seconds, something happened that the system had never recorded before. The object descended. Every prior detection showed level flight. Consistent altitude, consistent speed, then disappearance. This one dropped from 310 feet to 140 feet in the final 3 seconds of the track. That's a descent rate of more than 3,400 feet per minute. A controlled drone descent is 500 to 800. A free-falling object of the size indicated by the RCS would be faster, but this wasn't ballistic. The speed remained constant at 11 knots throughout the descent. It wasn't falling. It was coming down deliberately. And then it was gone. I marked the projected ground position. It was a residential block on Fulton Road. I picked up the phone and called the Cleveland PD non-emergency line. I identified myself, gave my credentials, and asked whether there were any active calls for service on that block. There were not. I asked them to do a welfare check at the address closest to my projected position, 3847 Fulton Road. They asked why. I said we detected unauthorized drone activity in the area and were concerned about potential surveillance of the property. It was the only explanation I could give that would make institutional sense. 40 minutes later, a patrol officer called me back. He'd knocked on the door at 3847 Fulton. A woman answered. She was fine. She lived alone. She had not seen or heard anything unusual. Her name was Edith Garza. She was 71. I thanked the officer and hung up. I wrote up the detection, noted the welfare check, and filed it. Then I sat at my station for the remaining 4 hours of my shift watching the corridor map, willing the next detection to happen while I was looking, because looking was the only thing I had that seemed to matter. Edith Garza was reported missing on November 18th. 3 days after the detection, I had watched descend toward her address. I found out because I had set a news alert for every address in the corridor. The report said her daughter had come to visit and found the house empty. Car in the driveway. Purse on the kitchen table. Shoes by the door. Television on. I stared at the alert on my phone for a long time. I had seen the thing come down toward her house. I had called the police. They had checked. She was fine. And then she wasn't. The timeline was wrong. It had always been wrong and I had missed it. I went back through every correlation. Almeida, detection August 4th, disappearance estimated August 3rd to 4th, Quezada, detection September 12th, last seen September 11th, Watkins, he disappeared October 9th, but I hadn't been able to check the detection timing because we were in the blackout period. The passive logs showed a detection on October 8th. The detections didn't coincide with the disappearances. They preceded them by 18 to 72 hours. Except for Garza. The detection was November 15th. The disappearance was November 18th, 72 hours. I had watched the thing descend toward her house 3 days before she vanished, and I had sent police to check on her, and she had been fine, and then she was gone anyway. The monitoring wasn't preventing it. The monitoring was slowing it down. Giving it more time between detections. More time between disappearances. But the disappearances still happened. Every detection in the corridor, whether I was watching or not, corresponded to someone who would be gone within 3 days. I was not containing anything. I was pacing it. I brought this to Daryl on November 19th. He listened. He pulled up the data. He verified the timeline correlation independently. Then he closed his workstation, turned to me, and said something that I think about every day. If we watch, it's slower and we see it coming. If we don't watch, it's faster and we don't. Which one do you want? Those can't be the only options. They might be. We could go public. We could take this to the FBI, to the media, too. To what end? We have RF logs and radar tracks that an FAA engineer already told us could be birds with ground-based spoofing equipment. We have a temporal correlation with missing persons cases that CPD has no evidence are connected. We have a theory that our own observation rate affects the frequency of the events, which sounds like. I know what it sounds like. Then you know what happens if we take it outside this room. I knew. I'd built enough target packages in my career to know the difference between evidence and pattern. What we had was pattern. Strong pattern. Internally consistent pattern. But pattern without a mechanism, without physical evidence, without a single piece of data that couldn't be alternatively explained by coincidence, sensor artifacts, and unrelated missing persons cases in a city with a high baseline missing rate. We would sound insane. And we would lose the ability to watch. That was the real trap. Not that the institution was silencing us, nobody was silencing anybody. Nobody knew. Our supervisors at the sheriff's office received monthly summary reports that showed detection counts by category. UF5s were a footnote. The FAA had sent their engineer and closed the consultation. There was no institutional suppression because there was no institutional awareness. We were 5 analysts in a windowless room watching a line on a map that meant nothing to anyone except us. And we could not stop watching because watching was the only thing that slowed it down. In December, I did something I hadn't done before. I drove to the corridor. Not to a specific address, just into it. I took Fulton Road south through the stockyards on a Tuesday afternoon, windows down despite the cold, looking up. The corridor is just a neighborhood. Row houses, corner stores, bus stops, churches, a strip of auto repair shops near Clark Avenue. Kids walking home from school. An old man raking leaves from a yard that barely had a tree. Nothing about the physical space suggested anything was wrong with it. There was no atmosphere. No chill. No wrongness you could feel. It was just Cleveland in winter, gray and ordinary and trying its best. I parked on West 32nd Street, outside the building where Gerald Watkins had lived. His apartment was on the first floor. The lights were off. A piece of certified mail was wedged in the screen door. It had been there long enough that the paper had swelled with moisture. I sat in my car and looked up at the sky. It was overcast, low ceiling, maybe 800 feet. A normal December sky. I tried to imagine something at 340 feet, invisible, broadcasting a registration number that didn't exist, moving northeast at 14 knots, changing shape between radar sweeps. I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't even describe what I was looking for. And I realized that was the problem that had been underneath everything since June. We had data. We had patterns. We had correlations. What we didn't have, what no one had, was a description of the thing itself. For witnesses on the night Almeida disappeared had described 4 different things. The radar said it was large and variable. The RF said it was a drone. None of those descriptions agreed with each other, and none of them agreed with the fact that whatever they described had been selecting people and removing them from their homes without a trace. I drove back to the center. When I got to my workstation, there was a flag on the screen. UF-5 detection, 3:41 p.m., while I had been sitting in my car in the corridor. The track terminated directly over the block where I had been parked. I felt something cold move through me. Not fear of the thing, fear of the question. Had it detected me? Had it come because I was there? Or had it been there the whole time, and I had been sitting under it without knowing? I checked the RF log. The emission lasted 7 seconds. The radar return showed an altitude of 280 feet, lower than any prior detection. And the RCS data showed something new, a secondary return, much smaller, at ground level, stationary, co-located with my car. Vortex had painted me. I was in the corridor data. Not as an analyst reviewing a detection, but as an object. A target. A return. I erased it. I want to be honest about that. I accessed the raw detection archive and deleted the ground-level return. I didn't touch the aerial track, that stayed in the system as a normal UF-5. But the secondary return that showed something on the ground at my position, I removed. It took 11 seconds. The system doesn't flag internal deletions by authorized analysts. I know what I did. I know why. Because if that return stayed in the log, it would mean I had been located by the thing I was tracking, and I could not sit in that room for 8 hours a day watching a corridor map if I believed the corridor was watching me back. Daryl never found out. Michelle never found out. I went on watching. December, January, February. The detections continued at the suppressed rate, roughly one per week with active monitoring. The disappearances continued at the same paced interval. One person every 3 to 4 weeks, always from an address within the corridor, always within 72 hours of a detection whose track terminated near their home. I kept a private list. Not in the system, in a notebook I kept in my car. Names, dates, addresses. By February, there were 9 names on it. 9 people who had walked out of the data the same way they had walked out of their homes. Quietly, completely, without evidence that anything had happened at all. CPD had no pattern. The cases were assigned to different detectives, in different precincts, with different caseloads. Missing adults without evidence of foul play are low priority in a city with Cleveland's crime volume. Nobody was connecting them because nobody had the corridor. I had the corridor. Only me and the 4 people in that room. And we could not explain it to anyone in a way that would survive the first question. In March, James Willett put in his 2 weeks. He said he'd taken a position with a private security firm in Virginia. Better money, better hours. He didn't say anything about the corridor, and I don't know whether the corridor was part of his reason for leaving. But when he cleaned out his workstation on his last day, he stopped by my desk and said, "The watch is the work, Renata. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't." I thought he meant the monitoring discipline. The professional commitment to staying alert. Now I think he meant something else. His replacement was a 26-year-old named Colin Pratt, fresh from the DHS Federal Protective Service, eager and precise and completely unaware of what the corridor was. Daryl and I had a conversation about whether to brief him. We decided not to, not out of secrecy, but because we wanted a clean test. If Colin sat the detection desk without knowing about the corridor and the detection still slowed during his shifts, it would suggest the suppression effect wasn't dependent on the analyst's awareness. It was dependent only on the presence of human attention on the data. Colin's first week on the day desk, 0 corridor detections. His second week, 0. His third week, 1 detection, at 1:12 p.m., while Colin was actively running a routine metro-wide RF sweep that included the corridor. He coded it UF5 without commenting on it. He had no reason to think it was significant. But that night, Michelle logged another detection in the same corridor section. And another the following night. 2 in 48 hours. The spacing was tightening. I checked the addresses. Both track termini pointed to the same block, a row of duplexes on Denison Avenue. I set my news alert. 3 days later, a couple named Yolanda and Peter Fisk were reported missing from 4512 Denison Avenue. 2 people. For the first time, it had taken 2 at once. I went into the bathroom at the center and stood at the sink for a long time. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was thinner than I'd been in June. I was sleeping less. I was driving through the corridor on my days off, which I knew was irrational but couldn't stop, because being in the corridor felt like watching it, and watching it was the only thing that slowed it down, and slowing it down was the only thing I could do. I was a containment system. Not a person investigating a phenomenon, a component in a suppression mechanism I didn't understand, performing a function I couldn't explain, achieving an outcome I couldn't verify except by counting the people who disappeared when I looked away. Daryl found me in the hallway afterward. He didn't ask if I was okay. He said, "I've requested an expansion of the sensor network for additional RF nodes in the corridor. If we can increase passive detection coverage, we might be able to maintain suppression without requiring continuous analyst attention." You believe it now. I've believed it since October. Why didn't you say anything? Because saying it doesn't help. Watching helps. Hardware helps. Personnel helps. Belief is irrelevant. The thing doesn't care what we think about it. It cares whether we're looking. The additional sensors were approved in April through a routine infrastructure request that Daryl filed as a coverage gap remediation. No one at the sheriff's office questioned it. The 4 new nodes went active on April 18, each one positioned on a rooftop within the corridor, each one adding another layer of passive RF detection that the system would monitor continuously. For 3 weeks after the nodes activated, there were no detections. 0. The corridor went completely silent for the first time since the previous June. No disappearances either. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the way you feel when a machine you've been listening to for months suddenly stops making noise. You don't think it's fixed. You think it's about to do something different. On May 11th, Lena came to work and reported that she'd received a notification from the Vortex system at 4:47 a.m. on her personal phone, through the Analyst Alert app, flagging a UF-5 detection. She'd been asleep. She hadn't reviewed it until she came in for her shift. The detection wasn't in the corridor. It was 16 miles east, over the suburb of Shaker Heights. Same frequency. Same registration, FA3-7791KX04, same altitude profile. Same disappearing track. A second corridor. I pulled the map. The new track ran northeast on an almost identical heading, 041 degrees magnetic. It passed over a residential neighborhood, traversed a commercial district, and terminated in a quiet section of tree-lined streets near a park. I started cross-referencing missing persons reports for the Shaker Heights area. I found one from 2 days earlier. A retired professor named Arthur Kibbe, 70, lived alone, car in the driveway, house undisturbed. The corridor had replicated. And it had done it during the 3 weeks of silence, while our new sensors were watching the original path and finding nothing, because the thing had simply moved to where we weren't looking. We didn't have enough sensors for Shaker Heights. We didn't have enough analysts. We had 5 people and a system built to monitor 11 nodes across a metro area, and the thing we were trying to suppress had just demonstrated that it could open a new corridor anywhere in the region. Daryl requested 8 more sensors that afternoon. They were denied. Budget constraints. The next appropriation cycle was 6 months away. He and I sat in the parking garage after shift and didn't speak for a long time. We can't cover it, I said. No. If we shift monitoring to Shaker Heights, the original corridor accelerates. Yes. If we stay on the original corridor, Shaker Heights runs uncontained. Yes. And if a third one opens, then we're doing triage. Watching wherever we can and accepting losses where we can't. Accepting losses. Those are people, Daryl. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. It wasn't exhaustion or frustration or anger. It was the face of a man who has been calculating something for months and has finally reached a number he can't work with. I know what they are, he said. That's why I'm still sitting in that room. I'm writing this from my workstation on a Tuesday afternoon. My screen shows the original corridor and, in a smaller window, the new one in Shaker Heights. Michelle is covering the original corridor overnight. Colin, who still doesn't know what he's looking at, runs the day desk with me, and I've arranged his display so that his routine sweeps naturally include both corridors without him needing to focus on them specifically. It's not ideal. It's not sufficient. But it's watching. And watching is what we have. 3 days ago, at 11:14 p.m., Michelle logged a UF-5 on a frequency we hadn't seen before. Not 915.7. A different frequency, 922.3 MHz. Same modulation scheme. Same impossible registration format, but a different number. The track was in Lakewood, west of the original corridor. A third heading, still northeast. A third line. She sent me a text at 6 a.m. It said, "New one. Check the log." I checked. I plotted the track. I ran the address correlation. I set the news alert. I'm sitting here watching 3 corridors on a system designed for 1. 2 analysts in the room, me and Colin, who I still haven't told because I don't know whether telling him helps or whether his unknowing attention is part of what makes the suppression work. 2 more analysts on evening and overnight. 1 system. 11 sensors, soon to be 15 if Daryl's emergency request goes through. And somewhere out there, past the edge of our RF coverage, past the limits of our radar, past every sensor and screen and analyst's eye, I know there are corridors we aren't seeing. Corridors that opened while we were looking at the ones we could find. Corridors running northeast through suburbs and cities and counties that don't have an IAMC, that don't have a vortex system, that don't have anyone watching at all. I think about that old man on Euclid Avenue who said he watched it land and walk. I think about how he was the only one of the 4 complainants who described it doing something other than flying. I pulled his complaint form again last week. His name was Leonard Pace. I looked him up. Leonard Pace has not been seen since October. I don't know what's in the corridor. I don't know what vortex is painting at 340 feet that changes shape between radar sweeps and broadcasts a registration number that doesn't exist. I don't know why watching it slows it down or where the people go or whether any of this is something I can stop. What I know is this: right now, at this moment, my screen is on. The corridors are visible. The data is being observed by a human being who understands what she's looking at. And the detections are slow today. That has to be enough. That has to be worth the cost of sitting in this chair, in this windowless room, watching 3 lines on a map grow longer, knowing that every time I blink, every time I look away to eat or sleep or drive home, the intervals compress and someone's shoes end up on their passenger seat. I requested authorization last week to add a 4th workstation dedicated exclusively to corridor monitoring. Daryl supported the request. It's pending. If it's approved, we'll need another analyst. Someone who can sit at a screen for 8 hours and watch data move without needing to understand why it matters. Someone who can do this job the way it was designed, as airspace monitoring, as counter-UAS operations, as the clean, apolitical work I came here looking for. Someone who won't ask what UF-5 means. Because I've started to think the answer to that question is the thing itself. I think the designation, unregistered flight, unconfirmable, retain and await recurrence, isn't describing a sensor limitation. It's describing the only relationship we're allowed to have with it. We can see it. We can log it. We can watch it come and go. We cannot name it, classify it, escalate it, or stop it. We can only be present. The screen is on. The corridors are live. The next detection will come when it comes, and I will be here, watching, because watching is the work and the work is all I have. And somewhere in the northeast dark past the edge of every sensor I've been given, the thing I can't describe is waiting for me to look away. I won't. Not today. Not today. But tonight, that's a different calculation. I've started sleeping at the center. Not officially. There's no cot, no shower, no authorization for it. But there's a couch in the break room that used to belong to the records annex staff, and I've found that if I set a proximity alarm on my workstation, a custom alert I built that pings my phone if any corridor detection fires, I can catch 3 or 4 hours between midnight and dawn without losing meaningful coverage. Michelle is on the overnight desk. She watches. I sleep with one hand on my phone and the vibration set to maximum. It started after the third corridor opened. 3 corridors, 5 analysts, 3 shifts. The math doesn't work. Someone always has to be watching, and someone always has to be sleeping, and the thing in the corridors knows the difference even if the system doesn't. Daryl noticed the pillow in my locker on a Thursday morning in late May. He didn't say anything about it. He brought me coffee and set it on my desk and went back to his workstation. The next Monday, there was a sleeping bag in his locker. We never discussed it. We just started trading off. May turned into June. The third corridor, Lakewood, running through the western suburbs, produced 2 more disappearances. Helen Musgrove, 63, from a bungalow on Hilliard Road. Dennis Padilla, 51, from an apartment on Madison Avenue. Same profile, always the same profile, car present, home intact, belongings undisturbed, phone left behind. CPD opened cases. Nobody connected them. Nobody could, because the connection existed only in a windowless room on the 3rd floor of the Justice Complex, on screens that 5 people were watching in shifts. 4 people, now. James was gone. Colin was his replacement. But Colin still didn't know. On June 3rd, I made the decision to tell him. It wasn't a strategic calculation. It wasn't because I determined that his knowing would improve the suppression effect. It was because I couldn't look at him anymore, this eager, competent 26-year-old running his sweeps and coding his UF1s and UF2s, and maintain the lie that his work was routine. He was sitting inside a containment operation he didn't know about, and his attention was being used, and I had been the one using it. I waited until we were alone on the day desk. Lena had called in sick. Daryl was at an interagency meeting downtown. I pulled my chair over to Colin's station and said, I need to show you something. It's going to sound like I'm having a breakdown. I need you to look at the data before you decide whether I am. He looked at me with the expression of a young professional who has just been told something is about to go off script. Then he nodded. I walked him through everything. The corridor. The detections. The registration number that doesn't exist. The RCS anomalies. The timeline correlations with missing persons cases. The observation rate data, the suppression effect. The replication. All 3 corridors. The names. I had 11 names by then. It took 90 minutes. He didn't interrupt. He verified each data point on his own screen as I presented it, which told me he'd been trained well and was taking me seriously even before he believed me. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Show me the deletion." I hadn't mentioned the deletion. The ground level return from December, the one I'd erased. I hadn't included it. What deletion? I said. The audit log shows a manual data removal from the corridor archive on December 14 at 16:47. Your credentials. I found it during my 2nd week. I assumed it was a calibration artifact you'd cleaned up. But if everything you just told me is real, then it wasn't calibration. I felt the floor shift slightly under me. Not literally. But in the way that happens when you realize someone has been closer to the truth than you thought, approaching it from a completely different direction. It was a secondary return, I said. Ground level. Co-located with my vehicle. I was parked in the corridor. It painted you. Yes. And you deleted it. Yes. Colin turned back to his screen. He pulled up the audit log, found the deletion record, and stared at it. Then he pulled up the corridor detection archive and ran a query I hadn't thought to run, a search for any other ground level returns in the corridor data, at any point in the entire detection history. The query returned 14 results. 14 secondary returns at ground level, co-located with the aerial corridor tracks, scattered across 9 months of data. I had only seen one, mine, because I had only looked once. The rest were buried in the raw radar archive, untagged by Vortex because they didn't match any UAS classification profile, logged as noise. Colin opened them one by one. Each return was stationary. Each was located at a residential address. Each coincided temporally with an aerial detection that terminated overhead. Each address was on my list. Not near my list. On it. Every ground-level return corresponded to the home of someone who had subsequently disappeared. The radar had been painting the targets before they vanished. Not just the aerial track terminus, the person. A return at ground level, inside a house, consistent with a human-sized radar cross-section at close range through residential construction. The system had been recording the selections. Every one. And I had been looking at the aerial data without ever checking what was beneath it. The system saw them, Colin said quietly. Vortex painted these people in their homes before they went missing. Painted something in their homes. Something human-sized, stationary, at the address of someone who disappeared within 72 hours. Yes. And nobody looked. The returns were below the classification threshold. The system treated them as ground clutter. Nobody looks at ground clutter in an airspace monitoring system. Colin pulled up the most recent corridor detections, the ones from the 3rd corridor in Lakewood. He filtered for secondary ground-level returns. 2 results. Both from addresses I hadn't checked yet. Both from the past week. He wrote down the addresses. 1174 Lakeland Avenue. 2830 Elba Avenue. Then he looked at me. Those are current, he said. I know. If the pattern holds, someone at those addresses disappears within 72 hours. I know. So we go. We go right now and we warn them. I had thought about this. I had thought about it every night for months, lying on that couch in the break room, listening to the hum of the HVAC system and the distant electronic pulse of Vortex processing data. I had thought about knocking on doors and saying what, exactly? That a radar system designed to track drones had painted something in their house and they should leave. And tell them what? I said. That our counter-drone system shows they've been selected by an unidentified aerial phenomenon. That they need to evacuate their home based on data that the FAA has already reviewed and attributed to birds and ground-based spoofing. We tell them they're in danger. Based on what? A correlation between sensor data and missing persons reports that no law enforcement agency has connected because the connection doesn't exist in any system except ours. It exists. You just showed me. 14 ground-level returns. 14 addresses. 14 missing people. and a deletion I committed to hide my own return from the record. How does that look in a briefing? How does that look in court? Colin stared at me. I could see him reaching the same wall I'd hit months ago, the wall where the data is real and the pattern is real and the people are real, and none of it is expressible in a form that any external authority would accept. Then we watch, he said. We watch. And we hope watching slows it down enough that those two people survive. That's what we have. He turned back to his screen. He pulled up the two addresses on the corridor map. He centered his display on them. He didn't say anything else for 2 hours. At 4:30 p.m., a detection fired. Third corridor, Lakewood. 922.3 MHz. Radar painted an object at 290 feet, descending. Track terminus, 1174 Lakeland Avenue. Ground level return, present. Human scale. Stationary. Colin and I both saw it. We watched the track for 11 seconds until it vanished. The ground return persisted for 3 additional seconds after the aerial contact disappeared, then it was gone too. That's someone, Colin said. Right now. That's someone sitting in their house and something is over them. He picked up the phone. I reached across and put my hand over his. A welfare check, he said. Just like you did for Garza. Garza disappeared 3 days later. But she was alive when they checked. She had 3 more days. 3 more days of what? She didn't know. She couldn't have known. And if we tell her, if we somehow get an officer to relay the message that an airspace monitoring center thinks something unidentifiable has selected her, what happens? She panics. She calls the news. The news calls our office. Our office reviews our logs. They find 9 months of UF5 data that we never escalated, a suppression theory that sounds like paranoid ideation, a corridor map we built off the books, and a data deletion I committed to hide my own targeting. They shut us down. And then nobody is watching. Colin took his hand off the phone. I hated myself for what I'd just done. I still hate myself. Because he was right, the instinct to warn someone, to intervene, to do the thing that protective systems are supposed to do, that was the correct instinct. And I overrode it. Not because I didn't care, but because I had spent 9 months calculating the cost of every possible action, and the only action that produced a net reduction in harm was the one that looked like inaction. Watching. Sustained, continuous, uneventful watching. The most passive form of engagement possible. And it was the only weapon we had. 1174 Lakeland Avenue belongs to a woman named Sarah Cho, 44, a dental hygienist. I know this because I looked her up that evening, the way I look all of them up, the way I add them to the notebook in my car like I'm keeping a roster of the condemned. As of this morning, Sarah Cho is still at that address. Her car has been in the driveway every day. Her porch light comes on at dusk and off at 11. I know this because I've been driving past her house every night on my way home. Not stopping. Not approaching. Just seeing. Confirming that she's still there. It has been 8 days since the detection. The pattern says 72 hours. She's still there. She's beaten the window. And I don't know whether that's because the watching is working, because 5 sets of human eyes on 3 corridors is exerting enough suppressive pressure to stretch the interval, or because the pattern is simply adjusting, learning, adapting to the pace we've set. The second address, 2830 Elba Avenue, belongs to a man named Kenneth Dane, 67, retired municipal worker. Colin drove past that one himself on his third day of knowing. He told me the next morning that the lights were on and a dog was barking inside. He looked relieved. Kenneth Dane was reported missing 6 days ago. His dog was found in the house, dehydrated but alive. Everything else, car, wallet, keys, phone, was exactly where you'd expect. Colin hasn't spoken about the corridors since. He monitors. He watches. He codes the detections. But the energy is different in him now. The eagerness is gone. In its place is something I recognize because I see it in Daryl, in Michelle, in the mirror, the flat, sustained attention of someone who has accepted a duty they can't explain, can't justify to anyone outside the room, and can't set down. There are 4 of us now who know. Daryl, Michelle, Colin, and me. Lena transferred to a regional fusion center in Akron last month. She cited personal reasons. I didn't press. Her replacement hasn't been hired yet, which means we're running 4 analysts across 3 shifts covering 3 corridors, and the 4th corridor opened 9 days ago. East Side. Euclid Avenue running through East Cleveland into Euclid proper. Same heading, northeast, 039 degrees. Same frequency as the original, 915.7. Same registration, FA 3-7791KX04. The first corridor's signature. Not a new one. The original. Michelle caught the detection on a Thursday overnight. She called me at 3 a.m. I was on the couch in the break room. I went to my workstation and pulled the data and felt something I can only describe as the moment when a map you've been reading becomes a territory you're standing in. The original registration, the one that had been confined to the West Side corridor for 9 months, had jumped 16 miles to the opposite side of the metro area and started a new line. Which means either there are 2 of them broadcasting the same identifier, or there is one and it can be in 2 places at once, or the identifier isn't attached to a single entity but to a process, a behavior, a method, a way of moving through airspace and through neighborhoods and through people that reproduces itself the way a frequency reproduces itself across a medium. I don't know which of those is true. I don't know whether any of them are categories that apply to what I'm tracking. I only know that the corridor map on my screen now shows 4 lines, all running roughly northeast, spread across a metro area of 2 million people, and that the detection rate across all 4 corridors is averaging 1 event every 19.6 hours. That's with 4 analysts watching. When there were 5 of us watching 2 corridors, the rate was 1 per 8.3 days. The ratio is collapsing. More corridors. Fewer watchers. Each detection carries the same 72-hour shadow. The math tells me we're losing approximately 1 person every 4 days now, and the only way to slow that rate is to add eyes, not sensors, not automation, not algorithms. The passive detection nodes I helped Daryl install did nothing to suppress the events. Only human attention on the live data correlates with reduced frequency. Vortex doesn't care. The system processes the data whether anyone reads it or not. What matters, what the thing in the corridors responds to, is a person looking at the screen and understanding what they're seeing. That's the part one keep returning to. Not looking. Understanding. Because Colin's data proved something subtle that changes everything, the suppression effect didn't begin when he started watching the corridors as part of routine sweeps. It began when he understood what he was looking at. His first 3 weeks of unknowing coverage produced 0 effect on the detection rate. The moment I briefed him and he grasped the pattern, his presence on the desk began contributing to suppression. The thing doesn't respond to observation. It responds to comprehension. Which means every analyst we add needs to be told. Needs to understand. Needs to carry the full weight of what the corridors are and what the detections mean and who the ground level returns represent. And they need to sit with that knowledge for 8 hours a day, watching lines on a map that point at people's homes, knowing that looking is the only thing keeping the interval open and that the interval is still not wide enough to save everyone. That's the job. That's what I'm recruiting for. Daryl and I drafted the position justification last week. We described it as an additional counter-UAS analyst to support expanded detection coverage across the metro area. The language is accurate. Every word of it is technically true. The 4th workstation has been approved. The posting goes live on Friday. Someone will apply. Someone qualified, precise, professional. Someone looking for clean work, the way I was. They'll come into this windowless room and sit at a screen and learn the system and believe, for a while, that what they're doing is monitoring airspace. And then one of us will have to sit with them and explain what UF5 actually means. Not the handbook definition, the real one. We'll have to show them the corridors, the detection patterns, the registration that doesn't exist, the ground level returns that resolve to the shape of a person in a house. We'll have to tell them about the 13 now, people who aren't missing because of anything the world can name, but who are gone in a way that leaves everything they owned exactly where they left it, as if they were lifted out of their own lives by something that took only them and nothing else. We'll have to tell them that watching is the only intervention that works, and that it doesn't work well enough, and that it works less well with each new corridor, and that corridors keep opening. And then we'll have to ask them to stay. I think about what James said when he left. The watch is the work. I understand now. He wasn't being philosophical. He was being literal. The watch, the act of sitting in a chair and looking at a screen with full knowledge of what the data represents, is not a means to an end. It is the end. It is the only thing we can do. Not investigate. Not escalate. Not intervene. Watch. Comprehend. And by comprehending, buy time. How much time? I ran the numbers yesterday. If the detection rate continues at its current trajectory and no new analysts are added, the corridors will saturate our monitoring capacity by September. After that, the compression accelerates unchecked. If new corridors continue opening at the observed rate of 1 every 5 to 6 weeks, by December there will be more active corridors in the metro area than our system can display simultaneously. And that's just Cleveland. I have no data on any other city. I have no way of knowing whether this is local or whether every metro area in the country has corridors running northeast through residential neighborhoods, painting people in their homes, taking them in the 72-hour window after the track descends. I have no way of knowing whether other cities have monitoring centers like ours, with analysts who've noticed the same pattern, who are sitting in their own windowless rooms watching their own lines on their own maps. I have no way of knowing whether anyone else is watching at all. There's one more thing I need to document, and it's the reason I'm writing this down instead of simply continuing to watch. Last Tuesday, June 10th, at 2:23 p.m., a detection fired in the original corridor. 915.7 MHz. FA 3-7791 KX04, radar tracked the object at 305 feet AGL for 8 seconds. Descending. Ground level return, human scale, stationary. The address was 3847 Fulton Road. Edith Garza's house. The house that has been empty since November. The house where a 71-year-old woman disappeared after I called in a welfare check and was told she was fine. Something was in that house again. Not Edith Garza. Whatever the radar paints at ground level, it isn't the person who lives there. It's the thing that was above them and is now inside, or beside them, or in the space where they were about to stop being. But the house has been empty for 7 months. There's no one left to take. Unless the return isn't looking for someone who's there. Unless it's waiting for someone who will be. The house is still listed as the personal residence of Edith Garza in every county database. It hasn't been foreclosed, relisted, or estate transferred. Her family, if she has family, hasn't claimed it. To the system, it's occupied. To the corridors, it's still a valid address. I've started checking the ground-level return archive for repeat detections at addresses where people have already disappeared. I've found 6 addresses, all previously associated with a disappearance, all showing new ground-level returns in the past 60 days. All still listed as occupied in municipal records. All empty. The corridors aren't just selecting new targets. They're revisiting old ones. Maintaining them. Keeping the addresses active the way a system keeps a file open, not because it needs the data, but because closing it would mean acknowledging the record is complete. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether it means the addresses will be repopulated, whether new tenants will move in and find themselves inside a corridor that already knows the house, or whether the returns are something else entirely, a kind of maintenance, a patrol, a counting of what's been taken. I only know that the corridors are not just expanding. They are deepening. They are building a history inside a system that was designed to watch the sky, and they are using the architecture of that system, the frequencies, the registration formats, the classification codes, to make themselves legible to us in exactly the way that prevents us from communicating what they are to anyone else. They look like drones. They broadcast like drones. They get coded like drones. And as long as they fit inside the UAS detection framework, every conversation about them begins and ends inside a vocabulary that cannot accommodate what they are. That's the design. Not our design. Theirs. I filed the 4th workstation request. Daryl co-signed it. The posting goes up Friday. Someone will see it on a job board and think it sounds interesting: airspace monitoring, counter-UAS operations, government benefits, stable hours. They'll apply. They'll interview. They'll sit across from me in a conference room and I'll ask them about their experience with multi-sensor data fusion and their comfort with overnight shifts and their willingness to work in a windowless environment for extended periods. And I'll be evaluating something I can't put in the interview rubric: whether they're the kind of person who can be told the truth about the corridors and still come back the next day. Because that's what this is now. Not a monitoring center. Not a counter-UAS operation. A watch. A vigil sustained by people who understand what they're looking at, held together by the knowledge that looking is the only thing between the detections and the disappearances, and that the margin gets thinner every week. The screen is on. 4 corridors, live. Daryl is at the station next to mine. Michelle will be here at midnight. Colin at 8 tomorrow morning. The posting goes up Friday. If you're reading this, and you're qualified, and you can sit in a room for 8 hours and watch data move across a map and hold in your mind the full weight of what that data means without looking away, we need you. The corridors are open. The detections are running. And the only thing I've found in 13 months of watching that makes any difference at all is that there's a human being on this side of the screen who knows what they're seeing. I can't tell you what's in the sky over Cleveland. I can't tell you where the people go. I can't tell you whether this will spread to your city or whether it already has. I can tell you that the interval between detections right now, at this moment, with 4 of us watching, is 21 hours and 14 minutes. And that's the longest it's been in 6 weeks. I'll take it. I'll take it, and I'll stay in this chair and I'll watch the corridors until my shift ends, and then I'll sleep on that couch, and then I'll come back and watch again. Because 21 hours is better than 19. And 19 is better than 12. And 12 is better than the 2.5-day average we measured when nobody was looking at all. The work is the watch. The watch is the work. The screen is on.